My name is Chris Thompson. I'm the executive director here at Generator, and I want to welcome you all to the last Reckless Ideas speaker series session of the, I say semester because I'm coming from the college world, of the winter, no, the fall, we'll call it the fall. And we're super excited about this. In a minute, I'm going to turn it over to my co-conspirator, Robin, but for right now, I do want to thank our sponsors. First off, Hula. They're making a fantastic co-working mecca just like a few blocks away, and they are very supportive of us, and we're excited to see what they do over there. And also, actually, the City of Burlington Mayor's Office are supporters of this speaker series as well. So when you see the mayor, say thank you. But at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Robin.
A little shorter. Hello, everybody. My name is Robin Perla. I'm a faculty at Champlain College. I am the program director of the Emergent Media Master's Program, and I also teach undergraduate classes in the Center for Communication and Creative Media. Sorry. And then in the back row, I'm going to give a shout out to Juniper Lovato, who works with the I did not get enough sleep last night. So the Complex Systems Lab at University of Vermont, and so the three of us and representatives of our programs have kind of launched this Reckless Ideas series. I think we're on the third year, and the idea is to kind of look for people from each of our communities, from Champlain, from UVM, from Generator, and the entrepreneurial communities who are sort of doing maybe interesting, maybe slightly reckless things, thinking about the intersection between art and technology and the humanities. So tonight, it is my privilege to introduce a colleague of mine and friend from Champlain College, Katheryn Wright. She is an associate professor in our core division, which is sort of our interdisciplinary studies program for undergraduates. Katheryn holds a PhD from Florida State University and specialized in media studies. And her research focuses on the emergence of a global screen culture by examining the everyday uses of screen technologies at media events. Well, at least maybe it used to. That was sort of her dissertation work. And we'll talk a little bit about her most current work in a second. She also studies the body and technology using critical frameworks, including biopower, affect theory, and the virtual. So she recently published a book, and I have to switch pages to tell you about it, so give me a second. And it's on my screen, right? She can critique my this experience that we're having right here. Her book is called The New Heroines, Female Embodiment and Technology in 21st Century Popular Culture. And this book explores how the next generation of teen and young adult heroines in popular culture are creating a new feminist ideal for the 21st century. And so a lot of what she's interested in, and this is, I think, maybe what we're going to talk about tonight, are sort of philosophical arguments about human subjectivities, including post-humanism, as well as addressing philosophical debates about female embodiment and technology in popular culture. So I'm really excited about this talk, and I think there might be some audience participation involved, right? So at the end, so you can get comfortable for a little while, but at some point, yeah, so, but just be yes, I always like to know ahead of time if I'm going to have to participate, so I thought I'd give you guys a little bit of a warning. So, welcome, Katheryn, thank you.
Thank you, Robin, for your introduction, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to come and really hear what is work in process for me, as I think all reckless ideas should be, as Robin was explaining what this series was about. So when she came to me a few weeks ago asking, do you have a reckless idea for this? What should you be doing? I actually had to think a little bit about what reckless meant. The work I've been doing is actually, in some ways, quite the opposite. It's about being very intentional and very purposeful in the practices and some of the things that you're doing in your everyday life. So I was like, reckless? I don't know. And so in thinking through what the idea of recklessness meant, Yeah, not caring about the consequences, well, I guess in some ways, what I've been working on, questions about posthumanism and walking, I'm going to just talk about like how I think they're reckless first. They're reckless because there's no actual application or product that I'm working towards. Well, I plan, and you will see, to never make any money off of what I'm doing. There is no product attached. There is nothing that I can even hold up to say this is a work of art, because in fact most of it's performance-based, which is artwork nonetheless, but it's not in the same way that I was a ceramicist as an undergrad, and so like when I think of art objects, I have a very, very specific articulation of what an art object is for me, and there's nothing that I'm creating, maybe a map or two for my own personal gratification. And so to me, that is the recklessness of thinking about the connection between posthumanism and walking. That the outcome, what we're doing, is actually a question mark. And so that's part of why, as Robin said, we'll have a little experiment. I think it's powerful to try to do this type of work, to think about what we're doing and why we're doing it. So, with that in mind, here's my reckless idea. We'll talk through. To be a better writer, artist, scholar, and person, / I realized I needed to learn how to walk like a posthuman. Okay. So, as a humanities and media studies scholar, I actually have a really tenuous relationship with a body of scholarship called Posthuman Studies. Humanities, posthuman. It feels like I'm being written out of the equation as a critic or as a scholar. I mean, in fact, in some ways, posthuman studies decenters the humanities and enters it into conversation with the biological sciences, the physics, with technology studies, with media, of course, with animal studies. It asks us to think about the connections between a variety of disciplines. And in that way, it's a little scary, because you're entering into disciplines that you're unfamiliar with. As somebody who's trained in the humanities, one of the things I've always been taught to do, and one of the things that I do to make money, right, at least to publish, is representational analysis. I look at something, I analyze it, I critique it, I engage with it. And posthuman studies is actually challenging even that model, that mode of analysis. It challenges just looking and critiquing. That's not enough. There's something else. And part of posthumanism is about non-representational studies and thinking about what are ways that we can engage in art and in practice and in technology that challenge that power dynamic of an outside observer looking and critiquing and examining the work of art. What else can we be doing in order to shift this relationship? So I've been fascinated with posthumanism for a very long time, but because it actually challenged the modes of analysis that I was being taught and trained as a humanities scholar, it was actually hard for me to do it. So I was reading a lot about posthumanism, but I couldn't figure out what it meant in my daily life. And so for me, thinking about walking and posthumanism is a first step, metaphor. Sorry, it's going to be bad, and I promise you it's going to be all night. So walking became a way for me to think about posthuman practices and philosophy, and to actually try to figure out how to do it and what doing posthumanism looks like. So I came to walking as a practice because there are a lot of different practices that you can engage with in the context of posthuman studies. In part because of my interest in globalization, and I like to do a lot of pop culture pilgrimages, going to different sites, looking at pop culture, thinking about the relationship between my body and place, and the things I was looking at. So I went to When I was in the Gambia, I went to Kunta Kinte Island as an example and examined the spaces and thought about my relationship with that. And I also, several years ago, participated in the Women's March in DC and thought about what my body was and what my place was as a walker through that protest. So thinking about protests as a form of walking, and that really piqued my attention. Also, a few years ago, a colleague showed me a YouTube video of a clip from a documentary. And it was a clip of a walk between one artist, one philosopher, between Judith Butler and Sonora Taylor. Sonora Taylor is an artist in disability rights and animal rights activist, and Judith Butler is a queer theorist and a feminist and gender and sexuality scholar. And they were going on a walk together and talked about what it means to walk. And I was like, that's really interesting. I've never thought about walking as like something that academics, we walk, but I never thought about it as a way to interrogate and engage with the world that I was examining as a humanities scholar, thinking about art. Well, I actually walk through museums. What does that mean? How does that position me as a walker? When I go into the movies, I'm engaging with movies and cinema in a really embodied way, but that didn't necessarily come across in the way I was writing or thinking about them. And so I discovered that I was interested in something that was much more embodied and much more practice-oriented. Rather than thinking about a thing to analyze, which is, again, what I was taught, I was thinking about the method, the practice that we used in order to understand and engage with the things that are surrounding us in our environments. And so to that end, I have been thinking about walking as a way to engage in a non-representational media studies. So that's like my scholarly, reckless idea that how do we walk through media and alongside and with media? And how does media shape the walks that we are engaged with? I think these are really important questions that are connected to questions of identity and power and I'm only at the beginning, in full honesty, at trying to figure out how walking as a methodology and practice can be used to uncover some of those power dynamics. So to that end, here is my working definition of walking. So walking, and so when I say walking, I'm referring to this. Walking is the practice of rhythmic, grounded movement. I've been trying to think about walking from a more inclusive perspective, not using it about like using 2 legs or using 4 legs or thinking of it only in the terms of terrestrial locomotion. So how am I thinking about walking? And so I want to start with explaining this a little bit. So first, the idea of grounded movement. Walking is connected to the ground. It is connected to the earth. It's connected to our environment and the material, the actual stuff in our environment. And I think that's important to note. When you think about the difference between walking and running, so when you run as a human, you're running and your 2 feet lift off the ground simultaneously. Walking, 1 foot is always grounded. That's actually the human distinction between running and walking. That there's always this groundedness that's attached to the act of walking. There's always movement. Movement is about change, about a shift in position, about transition between location. The act of walking is about movement. But it's also about movement, movement in your body. So there are multiple sites of movement that are occurring through the act of walking. Walking is the practice of rhythmic, grounded movement. So practice. I grew up having to, my parents forced me to play the piano, and you had to practice it, right? That's what I think of practice. It's something that you have to do over and over and over again. Something that ultimately, if you get good at something, you don't think about doing. It becomes a habit. The difference with walking, at least in the way I'm thinking about it, is that there is no recital that I have to do. Walking is a practice without an endpoint. For many, for some, I think for all of us, and the human and non-human, really. It's a learned skill. I have a 1-year-old, he just learned how to walk. It's been really beautiful seeing him figure out what it means to walk. We're not actually born with an innate ability to walk, humans. Animals, some animals are, right? So it's a distinction. But seeing that process of learning how to walk, it's something that's a skill, and something that it actually takes work doing. Walking is the practice of rhythmic, grounded movement. Rhythm. Pattern. Walking, to me, is a form of music. It's a form of dance. It creates sounds that you may or may not hear or listen to or pay attention to. This morning when I walked into class, I had been walking on a wet pavement because of the snow, and I started squeaking, and I became very, very self-conscious of my shoes, right? Squeaking on the ground, that sound. But that's part of the practice and part of the repetition of what it means to walk. I want to be very clear that I don't think you need 2 or 4 or, in fact, any legs to walk. You can walk with wheels. You can walk with a wheelchair. It is something that is personal and metaphoric. We walk the walk. We talk the talk. It's something that's physical and embodied. And because of all of those different tendrils, I find it really interesting as a practice to think about posthumanism. So, when you hear walking posthuman, this is my assumption that this pops up. So, robots, AI, maybe a little bit of Halloween, maybe a little bit of dressing up, thinking about AI and artificial intelligence, thinking about walking, and that's actually not what I'm talking about, though technology plays a key component in posthuman studies. Posthumanism is not about the world after the Terminators take over or something, right? It's not literally after human, right? Yeah. It's not about the robot takeover or the automaton. Well, it deals with questions of artificial intelligence and technology. But the in posthumanism is referring to really a body of philosophy. So it's referring to a set of philosophies that are trying to engage and understand the world after humanism. So humanism is a set of philosophical and cultural narratives that are aligned with Eurocentric, colonialist, sexist, and racist frames to encounter the world. That is the critique of a posthumanist of humanism. Now, if I was a humanist standing here, I wouldn't frame it in that way, right? So there's often a conflation of posthumanism and transhumanism. Transhumanism is the assumption that the body, the human body, I don't want to say is broken, but needs enhancing, right? And that we will fix ourselves via technology. Posthumanism challenges that idea, arguing that actually no, human bodies, all bodies are unique embodiments. And what we need to start thinking about is how we connect with and understand our relationship to technologies. Right? So the other image of posthuman walking, I think, is this. When I teach a class on posthumanism, and the apocalypse always comes up, right? And The Walking Dead. I actually have a friend who works on the Walking Dead site, so it's exciting for me. So again, I think in part the irony that the posthumanism does deal with the body as a material object. So if you're into this, you can look up things like necropolitics, so the politics of death, the politics of materiality. Think of questions of monstrosity and what it means to be a monster, and who defines whom is monstrous. And posthumanism, particularly in cybernetics and cyborg discourses, tries to center the monster. So it says, no, actually monsters are center to how we they're central to how we understand who we are. They're not on the margins of society. And we should look to cyborgs, to monsters, to hybrids, to these identities and subjectivities that have been marginalized in order to understand who we are. So posthuman is and isn't in some ways an apocalyptic narrative about what will be and what is in relation to our bodies and technologies and the material worlds that we occupy. So with that introduction about what this isn't, I guess, it's not zombies walking, though that could be fun, and it's not robots walking, though it is, I guess, ish. I wanted to provide like just a quick outline of how I'm going to frame the rest of my talk. So first, I'm going to give perhaps a more definitive definition of what posthuman studies is. The second thing is I'm going to connect the two. So thinking about posthumanism and walking and how they connect with each other. And then the third thing, as Robin said, I want us to play around with it and experiment with walking like a posthuman and figure out what that means. Does it work for you? Does it not work for you? Like, think about the embodied practice of walking, because really me standing here like explaining to you what it is, and probably poorly, is not like actually what we should be doing. We should have started walking and not finished with it. So with that in mind, this is an image to me that like encapsulates posthuman studies. This is Kiki Smith's My Blue Lake from 1995. It's a photogravure and lithograph. So what Smith did, she used a camera designed to capture geological features or topography in order to take a self-portrait. So these cameras are designed to take three-dimensional objects and flatten it. Right? And so you can see the focus was on her face, but then the rest of her body, right, becomes flattened in that context, and she painted it. And I think this has a lot of interesting like connotations about bodies and objects and earth and groundedness and identity, and that mix of pushing all of that together is really what posthuman studies is, very, very broadly. Posthumanism, as a body of philosophies and a field of study, examines the connections between the environment, between technologies, and between living and non-living things. Posthumanism engages with and critiques the methods and practices through which knowledge and truth are created. So it doesn't just look at the objects, right? It doesn't just look at the technologies, but it looks at what it means to make truth and what it means to make knowledge, and how humanism has, in some ways, negatively shaped the construction of that truth and the construction of that knowledge. So posthumanism is a practice. And posthumanism examines how power and position play a role in the formation of knowledge, in the formation of truth, and how so much of our understanding of the world has been based off of Eurocentric narratives, three primary Eurocentric narratives that I want to focus on tonight. One is the belief of bounded individualism, the belief that we are all individuals, autonomous, we are not connected, right? We have extreme agency. That belief in the bounded individual connects to the assumption of what is called human exceptionalism, that humans are exceptional creatures in this world, and that we have done everything for good and bad in it. Humans are the active agents against a passive everything else. That everything else includes technology, that everything else includes the environment, it includes animals. Humans are at the top of the chain, or of the hierarchy. A third narrative that posthumanism engages with and critiques is the belief in progress. It's actually hard to not think about progress because it's built into the language that we speak. When I talk about my son and his development, the language of development implies progress. It implies you're moving from point A to point B, and that point B is more desirable than point A. The language of innovation. We're just moving towards something that's inherently better. Yeah, there might be missteps along the way, but it's about getting better and better. Technological change is inevitable. Another assumption of a narrative of progress. We can't stop it, so just let it go, right? That my typewriter is less valuable than my laptop. Obviously, duh. It's progress. Posthumanism actually challenges those narratives. One of the interesting things is that walking and it's okay. It's okay, it's fine. So one of the cool things is that there are figures and humanist figures of walking and walking narratives. I'm good, so you can, it's okay if I move. So how many of you have heard the idea of the flaneur, right? The modern walker. The flaneur, the flaneuse, is a 19th century notion of a walker that is about perusing the urban landscape. So Walter Benjamin, who's a philosopher, looked back to the work of Baudelaire in order to understand this figure. The flaneur observes, assesses, he comments on his surroundings in the urban landscape. He operates with the expectation of accessibility. He can go wherever he wants to go without question. For Walter Benjamin, in the Arcades Project, the flaneur is an interpreter of the modern city. And so a description, if you don't know the flaneur, for Susan Buck-Morris's essay, so in her essay it's called The Flaneur, the Sandwichmen, and the Whore, she writes, if the flaneur has disappeared as a specific figure, a specific walking figure, it's because the perceptive attitude which he embodied saturates modern existence, specifically the society of mass consumption, and it is the source of its illusions. So the idea that we are consumers who can walk in and assess and interpret and critique and have open access to whatever spaces we want, that assumption is tied in to modern capital. And that assumption is also a humanist value about how we can walk. Well, there's actually problems with that, right? So that actually not everyone has open access to spaces, and that we are more than interpreters, than engagers, than consumers. And so Posthuman is asking, how are we more than this? Deborah Shaw, in book Posthuman Urbanism, argues that the figure of the flaneur aligns in contemporary context with what she calls a cyber flaneury. So the person who surfs the web and uses online communication to comment on and about urban spaces. So you're just the web surfer as an act or an idea of walking. So as you surf, you walk. It's no, so I think about browser names like Safari that all are evoking questions of direction and wayfinding and walking. And as a user, you're walking through these spaces, and with the presumption that you have access to anything. But again, that doesn't fit for all bodies and all people. Open access is a myth. But that myth is perpetuated by a modern humanist assumption of the cyber flaneury. Another connection between humanism and walking is the idea of the explorer. This is from a movie, the Wild movie, which is based on the book by Cheryl Strayed. So the book is about her going along the Pacific Crest Trail, and she explores it and figures and discovers her life. Well, that's actually a model of walking, the explorer, that's tied to humanism. Again, it's a similar issue that, well, who has access to these places? Who can go there? This idea of the explorer is in some ways tied to Thoreau. Thoreau wrote an essay called Walking that was published in 1862. And so in it, he explores how the power of the wild and wilderness against the onslaught of urban life. So, quote, "Hope in the future for me are not in lawns and cultivated fields, not in towns and cities, but in the impervious and quaking swamps." So Thoreau, as a person, has a really complicated relationship with manifest destiny, but in that quote, what he's doing is he's creating a binary between culture and nature, that these things are separated out. By focusing on the relationship between the environment, between bodies and humans and non-humans, posthumanism challenges the binary between nature, the wild, the out there that's waiting to explore, usually with the presumption that nobody was there before, and the city, the urban life, the cultural. Posthumanism is pushing against that binary. Posthumanism also pushes against the binary the idea that you can, through exploration, through learning and engaging with places that are out there waiting for you to uncover, that you then find yourself. Places are not out there. We make places and the everyday actions that we engage with on a daily basis. And so posthumanism as a body philosophy is challenging the presumption that there's a separation between bodies and place, that no, we're all connected. So the theme of posthuman studies, if you could not have guessed, at least in my interpretation of it, is connection, right? Integration, a coming together, a figuring out, thinking through relationships. So figures of walking have been more intimately tied to humanist as opposed to posthuman studies. The explorer, the flaneur, walking through urban life, walking across the forest or whatever, that those are humanist. They are about bounded individuals. Cheryl Strayed walking across the Pacific Crest Trail, discovering who she is. The shopper going into a store and buying something and making a personal choice about his or her or their identity. It's about progress and that there's this line between culture and nature and wilderness and urbanism, right? There's series or presumptions about what is progressive, what is important, what is innovative in those spaces, right? And both of them privilege humans. The walker is always human in both of those narratives. We don't care about the dog that's hanging out with the flaneur walking through the urban streets. One of the cool things about Wild is she talks a lot about her backpack, but it's not about the self-discovery of the backpack she's wearing, right? No, that's a passive object against her and her self-discovery of who she is. And so when posthumanism asks us to level the playing field between all of this stuff to say that actually we as humans aren't that exceptional and that we should actually start to think about the integration of all of these things in our environments in the world, and it, I think, asks us to walk differently, to engage with our landscapes and the places that we're at in a different way. And so this is what I'm asking us to think about when I ask the question, how can we walk like a posthuman? How can we not be an explorer out looking for the world, looking to discover yourself, or not be a consumer ready to buy or interpreting or critiquing, liking on Facebook? How can we do and engage with the world in different ways? And to me, this is a really powerful thing that actually, as I said, has no endpoint. You can't sell it, right? It's a practice. It's something that you do every day to think through and be very intentional about how you relate to the world as a human. Okay, so here are some things that I have been playing around with as suggestions on how to walk like a posthuman. So 1, you make walking a practice. Now, I define walking as a practice, but I think it's also a habit that we don't think of as practice, right? And this is my son. He's cute, right? And that's my dog. Here. So posthumanism is about the playful combinations and recombinations of ideas and things. Knowledge is found through practice. It is not out there waiting to be discovered. It is something that we do. The method of creating knowledge is inseparable from the method. There's no objective observer that's standing, observing, looking, critiquing. That implies an individual that can separate him or herself outside of the environment. The walker is part of the process rather than distinct from it. So a lot of posthuman walking methodologies use Guy Debord's theory of the dérive. I have horrible French, so I apologize, which is translated the drift, and Debord is interested in psychogeography, so if you're looking up a keyword, like psychogeography is a cool frame to look at. So what he does is, in order to make walking a practice, he asks us to think of a series of protocols or rules. So you impose rules on yourself in order to bring yourself out of like the habits of just going to the bathroom or going not to the bathroom. So as an example, you carry a coin, and instead of going to where you intend to buy your shirt or something, you flip a coin when you come to a stop, and then if it's heads, you turn right, and if it's tails, you turn left, and you go on a walk using that protocol and explore Burlington with a coin as opposed to your phone, right? As opposed to having a definable direction, you play. And you play with rules. And that playing allows you to understand your body in relation to the place in a more intentional way. It already has existed. It's about you recognizing that connection. The other thing that I think connects with making walking a practice is the importance of showing your work. So I think in an effort to consider how your positionality enters into and creates the places where you're walking, you need to show what you're doing. So this is a walk that I went on that's a part of my daily walking practice on a trail behind my house. And this was sadly like a month ago because it's super snowy outside. But that this practice, this idea of like, where am I going? What am I doing? Images are one way of showing your work, right? So, but there are others. What does it mean to show and to recognize your positionality in the places that you're occupying? I think that, to me, is the question that we need to engage with. We need to think about process over product. The next thing that I've come to in terms of figuring out how to walk like a posthuman is acknowledging the land, the ground where I walk. So a land acknowledgement is, in fact, I encountered the first land acknowledgement in public several years ago when I went to a digital humanities conference. A land acknowledgement is a public statement about who is a steward, a traditional steward of the land. And so in our context, it's recognizing the importance of the Abenaki in terms of how they engage with and understand and the historical connections to the land that indigenous communities have. This is actually a really cool digital mapping project that maps out, it's nativelands.ca, and I have a link to this presentation if this is interesting to you. And so one of the interesting things about land acknowledgements is that the notion of a bounded land is very different. Maps in the modern sense are not made to understand the porousness of boundaries. And so this is an attempt to try to understand those relationships visually through map. I think acknowledging the land brings up questions related to settler colonialism. It challenges the premise that there's an open place, unoccupied, that's there for us to explore. We, in conversation with the past and the present, make the places where we walk. Acknowledging the land also connects back to the idea of groundedness, to history, to context, to culture, and ecology. These are bound together. And we need to figure out that boundedness instead of trying to rip them apart. The focus, again, is on those connectivities rather than those separations. And our models of knowledge are meant to be separate, right? You're a scientist, you're a humanities person, you're an anthropologist. We're meant to separate knowledge, not to see those connections. I mentioned land acknowledgements and the power of acknowledging the land to also affirm the power relations that are attached to walking between humans, right, between different humans, but also between humans and non-humans, objects and things. Who is producing place? What is the role your body plays in the production of the places where you're walking and where you're occupying? What role do you play in the creation of place? The next thing I've learned is the idea of, I call it meet the world with. There's a walking methodology and it's called the Walking Lab, a collective of people who are interested in exploring walking methodologies and walking in the connection with posthumanism. And so they advocate for the idea of walking with as a methodology, as a way to think about how you're encountering and engaging with places. So instead of walking through or walking across or over without thinking about those connectivities, what does it mean to walk with? Walking methodologies ask us to walk with, ask us to think about the relationship between our emotions at both individual and a social level, about our movements, about our rhythms, and how our rhythms come in contact with other rhythms and form communities, about our politics and place, and how all of these combined make up the more than human worlds that we all exist within. So my advice in order to meet the world with is to take your freaking headphones off. It's one of my pet peeves, except if you're listening to a walking audio tour that's like very intentional, so put your headphones back on. So it's not really advice at all. But I think that one of the powers of walking methodologies is the ability to engage with your world, your sensory world in new ways, and that's been really powerful for me as somebody who grew up and continues to hate my body and to have a very interesting and difficult relationship with my own embodiment, to be open to figuring out how I relate with the world through my body is like jumping off a cliff for me. And I think that openness, walking without headphones in a metaphorical sense, is powerful. The next thing I've tried to do in order to walk like a posthuman is, so I said, ask questions by creating maps. Maps are an interesting object because maps can control and define spaces and separate spaces from other spaces. Maps are about power. Right? There's a really good book, it's old now, Dennis Wood's The Power of Maps, which looks at how maps are part and parcel of the colonialist system, right? In order to control and define and plant the flag and create a territory and own the world. But I think maps can do other things, and so I'm interested in maps that actually ask us to ask questions instead of to control spaces. So what does it mean to use map making and creative cartographies not to define boundaries, but to ask questions? Mapping invites creators to understand relationships between themselves and the worlds that they're walking through. This isn't a representation of a place, but a collaborative composition between place and the different actors, people, technologies, environments within that space. Maps are a response rather than a representation. This is an example of a very quick urban print that I made. So I used this grate underneath it, and I rolled, this is screen printing ink, and rolled it to try to create, in some ways, a trace of the environment where I was walking through. It was a response to where I was at, not a claiming of it. And I think that there's a very important, it's almost like walking on a razor's edge, see, another, right? That there's a push and pull in terms of what it means to control versus to respond to where you're at. The final thing I've been trying to play with and learn through this connection between walking and posthumanism is I've been trying to think about what it means to engage in a cartography of inclusion. So returning to the book I mentioned earlier, Shaw's Posthuman Urbanism, she discusses the idea of a cartography of exclusion. So a cartography of exclusion focuses on defining boundaries and controlling spaces, particularly through fear and anxiety. So I think of people who really like security systems, and they want to make sure that their space is their space. right? And I think of that in a microcosm of a house, and I think of it at a national level with a wall. Right. So a cartography of exclusion is about controlling spaces through fear. Right. They're coming to get me, so I need to mark off this territory. Well, posthumanism asks us to do the opposite, not to mark off, but to connect. So what does a cartography of inclusion imply? For me, it's about, rather than drawing boundaries, it's about thinking through the ethical commitments we have as we walk with others. Others being non-human, the environment, the soil that we exist within, the sky, our kids, the animals that we're engaged with, that we see and not see, don't see, the lichen, the leaves, right? Those are who we are walking with. We are not centered in that. The world is not made for humans. It's made for all of us. And what does that mean to engage in a walking practice that puts that inclusive frame at the center? It's a very different articulation of inclusion if you are engaged with diversity and inclusion work, which I think sometimes continues to reify human-centric narratives. This is actually a challenge to that. One of the things I think a cartography of inclusion does is, instead of asking us to speak as, I speak as this, or I speak as that, I'm drawing my line, I'm constructing my identity, I'm bounding myself off and differentiating me from you. It asks us to walk with as a form of political, critical praxis that brings together reflection with practice. What does it mean to walk with others in environments in which we're visitors? I think, to me, those are important questions that I have no answer to, but I think the practice of walking helps me figure at least out those inquiries. Walking methodologies are not a human-driven research design. The human is not at the center of them. Instead, they're place-centered. It's about understanding and articulating places, not understanding who I am, just like Cheryl Strayed, and like through this form of self-discovery. That might be a nice byproduct, but it's about understanding the places where we're at. Thinking about place in this really dynamic way, not just a physical location, but a whole entire sense of place. The sense of place that we have here, even in this space, and how it's constructed and what it means. Place is transmedia, it's transmaterial, and place is always in experimentation. It's always under construction. Oh, sorry, I didn't even talk about this really cool freaking project. So this is a really cool walking project. So this is an audio, so this is when it's okay to put headphones on. And this is a walking project that was created through the Walking Lab, created by Rebecca Conroy. And it's